We are back on Morning Line. Thanks for joining us this morning, talking about politics, international relations, basically the crisis right now involving North Korea and where the U.S. goes with them. Professor Tom Schwartz is with us from Vanderbilt. He's actually been to North Korea briefly. Real quick, before we get to the phone calls, lines are open. This was a visit.
I was doing a research project where I was in Seoul, and in Seoul you can take a bus up to the demilitarized zone, and when you go to the demilitarized zone as a tour, you have to sign a waiver that you can be there, and if anything happens to you, you're not going to sue the American government. But you can then, there is a negotiating, a small house negotiating that sits right on the border. And if they're not in use, you can actually go into the house and walk around it, and technically you're in North Korea.
And the demilitarized zone is, again, the fenced-in area between, and it's like there's a fence here, and there's a no man's land in between.
Yes.
How wide is that?
It's actually considerable. I mean, the zone.
I mean, you can see across it like a mile,
yeah,
a half mile.
It goes quite a ways. There's actually a whole area that's been untouched by that actually has all sorts of wildlife and animals that have been untouched by anyone in the last 50, 60 years.
It's just a neutral zone. You don't go in there, but there is a pathway where you go to that negotiating. And when you were there were no North Koreans in that negotiating. You just walk in, but you're basically on North Korean soil there.
Right.
So you were there.
Yeah, so I actually can say that I touched North Korean soil.
Interesting. Yeah. All right, let's go to Joe. Joe, good morning.
Good morning, Nick.
Hi, Joe. What you think?
Just a question for the professor.
Yeah.
How does he think that Washington and the president are handling this situation? It seems to me that even Tillerson has backed away from the negotiation talk to more will strike back at you talk. And I just wonder what his take is on it, how they're handling this in general. There seems to be a division, even in Washington, about which way to handle this situation.
Great question. I mean, Donald Trump's not the first one to use strong language with regard. His language is just more colorful.
Yes.
What do you think?
Well, if you think about it, I mean, George Bush called North Korea part of the axis of evil, even Barack Obama. And the North Koreans were vicious toward Barack Obama with lots of racial insults and everything else against him. Barack Obama evidently also this was the problem that he told Donald Trump would be foremost for his national security when they met in November. So I think the Trump administration, like the Obama administration, they're different views. I do think they've decided that the era of waiting it out has now ended because of the North Korean missile tests. It seems to be clear that the North Koreans have made dramatic advances in their ability to test the missiles. The initial approach seemed to be that Trump was going to try to pressure China. And
it seems like China at least signed on the sanctions.
Signed on the sanctions, and so China has been pushed at least in one direction. Trump has also threatened, in a sense, that if China doesn't move further, he might do other things that would hurt Chinese economic interests as a way of trying to pressure them to do more against North Korea. China, I think, for some of them is seen as the key. I think to some extent, Mattis and McMaster, Mattis, the Defense Secretary, McMaster, the National Security Advisor, are trying to indicate to China, we are very serious about this, so we want you to act. And so my own sense is that most of this rhetoric and everything is designed to convince the Chinese how serious we are, since they are the one country with real leverage over North Korea that could possibly contain the threat.
Okay. All right. Let's go to Mike. Mike, good morning.
Morning, Nick. How are you this morning?
Good. Hi, Mike.
Number one, I served in the military and the work of the military, so I don't want to see this, and any combat veteran would say the same thing. But I think now that lesser minds have shut their mouths off, Nikki Haley has to go before the United Nations and say that we are definitely at the point of a gun, and that any actions by North Korea, any missile test, anything's now going to be considered an act of war. What I wanted to ask the professor was, I can remember when I grew up, the issues were the missiles of October. And President Kennedy, I can remember sitting in front of a black and white TV, listening to President Kennedy address the nation, where he told the Russians and the Cubans, before he was going to allow nuclear missiles being pointed at the United States 90 miles away, he would flatly blow Cuba off the face of the earth. And he sent the blockade down there to show that he was serious. How much difference is this statement going on with President Trump and what President Kennedy made in that statement back then? What's the difference?
Yeah, that's great, Mike. And of course, he's referring to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I've thought the same thing. What do you think? That's a good question.
Well, the Cuban Missile Crisis, of course, occurred at a time where you were dealing with the possibility of full-scale nuclear war. And nuclear war at that time meaning the destruction of lots of the United States' cities. I mean, in that sense, the North Korean threat, as serious as it is, does not rise to that same level as the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy also, though, was trying to convey his seriousness through the blockade. It's possible that the United States will undertake some actions. I think Castro was seen a bit like a Kim Jong-un, but the United States made it absolutely clear to the Soviets that if Castro did anything, they would blame the Soviets. So that the Soviets were on record, Khrushchev was on record, the leader.
Khrushchev said things like what Kim Jong-un says. He said things like, we'll bury you, or we're going to send, we're manufacturing nuclear weapons like sausages, you know, and so he was throwing kind of that hyperbole out there as well.
He did, although, you know, when push came to shove, he was extraordinarily aware of how vulnerable the Russians were at that time to American nuclear strike. So there are comparisons. I think Trump could learn something in terms from studying the Cuban Missile Crisis in terms of what can go wrong, because we came very close to actually undertaking military action in Cuba, and that would have been a disaster because there were nuclear weapons already on the island that would have been used against our forces. So I do think there are some lessons there. I think the context is somewhat different because this is still, North Korea is still a more of a regional issue than it is a global one, and I think we do not think China would retaliate against the United States if we attacked North Korea. China's alliance, China has indicated strongly that it doesn't support North Korea on this issue. So I think there are some differences, but obviously the nuclear thing makes the comparison there.
Sure, I thought the same thing. Lines open, 737-7587 if you want to join in the conversation on how you're viewing this, and if it scares you. Let's go to Taylor. Taylor, good morning.
Good morning, Nick.
Hey, Taylor.
Haven't talked to you in a while, and good morning, Professor.
Good to hear from you.
We're talking about the paranoia of Korea. Well, there's also more paranoia in China than I think we give credit to, as to not wanting any hint of a unification of the Korea Peninsula by the South. They, of course, at the end of the Korean conflict, sent in troops like crazy to help out the North Koreans, which wound up causing there to be the truce between the two. Now, I have flown over Guam approximately 10 years ago, and I'll bet there were probably 50 or more of the old B-52 bombers sitting on a special runway in Guam that could, and it wouldn't surprise me at all if they're not still there with bomb capabilities. Those things are deadly, deadly, deadly. So the billion-dollar sanction that's been put on recently, if China and the other countries will abide by that, I think it'll go a long ways in trying to solve this thing. But if it's ignored or partially ignored or totally ignored, then that is going to turn out to be worthless. But if it works, and if the United States can put enough pressure on China, and there might be some retaliation from China in trade and other things, but if the United States is willing to take that chance with China, I think they can get a change in the...
Yeah, and what's happened? Listen, I think Taylor, I think what he was going to probably add there is that it takes money to do this military stuff that North Korea is doing. Now, China, and he's right about the sanctions, the rest of the world can lay it down, but doesn't China, I thought I saw a stat somewhere where they basically account for 90% of some of the resources that North Korea depends on. The rest of us can all abide by it lock, stock, and barrel, and yet that's still going to be, you know, only 10%. It's not going to hurt them. But if China puts the squeeze on, when they control 90% of some of the, and North Korea is completely dependent on a lot of things from outside. They don't have a ton of natural resources, right? That's the key. How much is China willing to hold back, do we think?
You know, Taylor made the point, which I think is a reasonable one, that China does not want a unified Korean peninsula. China
they want
prefers,
their side of communism, and, you know, over there, whatever you want to call it.
They fought to preserve North Korea. They actually sacrificed close to 1 million casualties in the Korean War. So they suffered in order to preserve the regime. Now, they haven't gotten along with the regime, and if you talk to a lot of Chinese scholars and others today, many will tell you that they think of North Korea as a burden that's on them, not an ally, that they would prefer. And in fact, China carries out more trade with South Korea now. On the other hand, they don't want American forces, for example, right on their border if North Korea was to collapse and Korea was to be reunified and the United States maintained its alliance. There is an argument that the United States could engage China in negotiations, saying that were North Korea to collapse, we would not continue to have military forces in South Korea, and try to reassure them on security. But whether that's actually gone on or not, whether there's been secret negotiations to try to reassure China that if they would cooperate on this, we would not take advantage of it, that's hard to know. But that certainly has been speculated about.
Now that's interesting. Okay, now the other point of it then, so we know they are interested in keeping it split. But how far do you think China will go to constrict the 90% of assets that they actually send over there in trade with North Korea? I mean,
that's really, we don't know.
Because if they choose to, I mean, you wonder who can solve this, and it's basically China. If our president could find a way to negotiate with them and work out, if China puts enough of an economic squeeze on North Korea, it sounds to me like that would put them in such dire straits financially, you know, and the country could collapse economically, that they probably say, okay, well, we'll back off, we'll negotiate, we'll stop test launching, and then you work things out. But China can do that, I would think.
China could, but China would also suffer from it.
How
would suffer both in terms of losing, of course, the trade with North Korea, which in that part of China, the part that borders on North Korea, is actually a poorer part and is more dependent than, say, the southern, more prosperous part of China. So it would lose that. It also would face the problem of exactly what you were saying, that were North Korea to collapse, there would be a huge refugee issue, possibly, and all the rest.
They don't want that.
They don't want disorder.
Well, so I'm hoping it doesn't get to that point. China puts the squeeze on, and within a few weeks, North Korea realizes, oh, well, we're going to go under if we don't, you know, change our ways. And then the sanctions are lifted, they negotiate, and we talk it out.
Yeah. That would be the ideal setting, although of course North Korea then could simply buy itself time, make some verbal assurances and continue the program.
Which is what they seem to have always done anyway.
Which they have seemed to do, which is why the administration, of course, has been pushing harder this time for some sort of a absolute commitment.
Take a break on that note. When we come back, Grady and others, if you're on hold, stay there. We'll get to your phone calls, 737-7587. What do you think we should do? Why can't we just send in SEAL Team 6? All right, we'll take a break. Be back with more right after this.